Hi, Bruce Adolphe here with episode 11. My Aunt Nancy, who was one of my father's 5 sisters, always found a way to mention death, usually by saying died, dead, no matter what the conversation was about. In my family, we all knew this about her. One evening, on the way to dinner at Aunt Nancy's place, we took bets. How long would it take for Aunt Nancy to mention death if no one prompted her in any way? The bets ranged from 30 seconds to 3 minutes. We arrived and sat around the dinner table. There was a challah bread in a dish in the center of the table. "Aunt Nancy, did you bake that challah?" someone asked. Her response was, "No. Once a friend of mine bought a frozen challah to bake and left it in the back seat of the car, and her dog ate it, and it expanded in the dog's stomach, and the dog exploded, died, dead." 10 seconds. No one had expected that. I told this story to many friends over the years. The story spread to Italy. Early one morning, when I came down the stairs of our friend's home in Milan, people were already gathered around the breakfast table, and our hostess was saying, "Il cane è esplose, morto." Aunt Nancy was small, maybe just over 5 feet, and she talked a lot, and not only about death. Her husband, known as Uncle Herman to us, was over 6 feet tall and said very little, although he would find the opportunity to tell a joke if he could get a word in, and it was usually the same joke. Nancy seemed to like this joke and would dart her eyes around looking for approval, since the laughter was muted and brief. Aunt Nancy felt that she had everything under control at all times, and that included covering her furniture with plastic. I mean, you wouldn't want to actually sit on the fabric of a couch or an armchair, would you? What if you dropped a cashew on the couch, and when you stood up, the cashew would slip between the cushions and stay there, rotting forever? That could not happen with plastic furniture covers. But more importantly, that could not happen because she did not let you eat the cashews that she put in little glass bowls, all around the apartment. She would say, "No, not before dinner." And after dinner, she would say, "Don't insult me by eating those cashews after my home-cooked dinner." I remember that one evening my father, whose name was Jules, told Aunt Nancy quietly that if she put out cashews, the kids should be allowed to eat them. And if she did not want them to be eaten, she should not put them out to begin with. It was this sort of display of rabbinical wisdom that made my Aunt Nancy idolize my father. She got the message. She understood the message about the cashews. She put out candies instead and discouraged us from eating those in the same old way. When Aunt Nancy invited family over to her place for dinner, she always said, "What do you want? I have everything ready. You name it. Roast beef, roast chicken, salmon, potatoes, rice, broccoli, chicken soup, whatever. It's all in the freezer. Just name it." In addition to the full-size refrigerator in her kitchen, Aunt Nancy had 2 giant freezers in the bedroom that she shared with Uncle Herman. The freezers were stocked differently. One had uncooked foods, the other was fully cooked meals frozen for later use. She had a card catalog for reference. There she could look up the desired items on time to thaw and reheat. Aunt Nancy was clearly the family matriarch. She was the oldest sister and claimed the right of total family control. When I was 10, and she learned that I wanted to be a pianist and composer, she made it known that, in her opinion, I should not listen to or play any German music. At 10, I didn't yet have a clear picture of the Second World War or of the Holocaust. although I would very soon learn about it. I told her I was practicing Beethoven's sonatas, and she tried to convince me and my family that the only proper way for me to be a musician was to become a cantor. My father died when I was 12, and my brother, Jonathan, was 15. That morning, John and I were awoken by Uncle Herman, which was already a shock because Herman did not live with us, and so his being in our room made no sense. He told us to get dressed quickly, that relatives were gathering in our living room because Jules had died in his sleep, and that our mother was beside herself, being consoled, and she wanted to see us. Jules was 57. The night before, he and our mother had gone to see the Martha Graham Dance Company. And when they said goodnight to my brother and me, Jules walked out the front door in a funny way that we had seen him do many times. It was like a vaudevillian's exit off stage after a comedy. That was the last John and I saw of him. Anita, our mother, died when I was 19. My brother, at 22, was no longer living in the family home, and I was commuting to Juilliard by train and staying occasionally with various friends in Manhattan. When I had a concert at school, I stayed over and commuted to come home. Aunt Nancy was upset when I told her my composition teacher was named Vincent Persichetti. "That doesn't sound Jewish," she said grimly. My brother and I decided to rent our basement out so we could pay bills. Our tenant was a young visual artist named Cindy. She had some serious arguments with her boyfriend, who was not supposed to be living with her in our basement, according to the agreement we had signed with her. One day, the police came to my house to ask if we knew of a prowler in the neighborhood who had broken into some local homes. The prowler turned out to be Cindy's boyfriend, who was staying in our basement. It was Cindy who answered the front door of our house when Aunt Nancy and Uncle Herman came to visit one day while I was out at Juilliard. When I arrived home in the early evening, I found a note taped to the front door. It said, "We were here and you were not. Now you're here and we are not." I thought that was funny. Signed, Aunt Nancy and Uncle Herman. As soon as I entered, I noticed that things were missing from the shelves of the large bookcase that stood just inside the doorway. Missing was a brass menorah shaped like a ship that we had used since I was a little child. Some coffee table books that had been stacked on their sides, a few silver kiddish cups. I looked around the living room, and it looked undisturbed. Had Aunt Nancy and Uncle Herman taken the menorah, the books, and the silver cups? Suddenly, I felt my forehead break into a sweat, and I sprinted into my parents' bedroom, which had been my mother's alone for 8 years. As a little child, I always felt that my parents' bedroom held some kind of mystical properties. When John and I were supposed to be asleep in our beds, and our bedroom door was open, I could see across the small hall to our parents' bedroom door, with its thin line of light between the bottom of the door and the threshold. I would stare at that light until it suddenly would vanish. I knew they had merely turned off the light, but it was a magical moment that I waited for every night. My mother's clothes closet, with its sliding double doors and indented brass circles for handles, was in her bedroom, while my father's clothes closet was in the hallway. For 8 years after my mother's death, my father's clothes were still in that hallway closet, including his folksy Romanian shirts with the billowing sleeves, tall cowboy boots, a top hat, all of which I wore during the 1970s. And the top hat became something that I got very attached to. I still have dreams in which I am rummaging in his closet for my clothes and finding the closet to be endlessly deep with rows and rows of costumes. And in these dreams, I usually become aware that there is another dimension accessible at the very back of the closet, if I can ever find it. A dimension in which my father is still living in secret, unable to get back to our world. I opened the door to my mother's bedroom to see if Aunt Nancy and Uncle Herman had taken anything from it. At first, everything looked in order. But then I slid open her closet doors and everything was gone. I started to shake with rage. I ran to the kitchen to use the only telephone in the house. It was an old rotary dial phone, and when one is trembling with fury, it is not so easy to dial the 10 necessary numbers on a rotary phone. My finger kept slipping out of the holes. I must have had to start dialing over 6 times before I stopped and walked around the living room to calm down. Then I came back into the kitchen and I dialed the numbers successfully. When Aunt Nancy answered the phone, I could not contain my anger. "Did you just take all my mother's clothes and things?" "What's the matter with you? Of course. We left you a note. You had no right to come into my house and take anything you wanted. That's stealing." My Aunt Nancy said, "What do you need her clothes for?" "That is not the point." And she continued, "And you don't need a menorah. You wouldn't use it." "You stole that too," I said. "Herman," she yelled, and handed the receiver to Uncle Herman. "What's all this? What's the matter?" he asked. I could hear Aunt Nancy shouting in the background. "You and Aunt Nancy came into my home, and without asking, you took all my mother's clothes, the menorah, the books, and who knows what else. What did you think you were doing? Her things are not yours to take. This is stealing, and I am furious at both of you." Uncle Herman said, "You cannot yell at your elders this way. You are no longer a member of this family as far as we are concerned." He hung up. Now, I was not only outraged, but in shock. I was not their son, and yet they had disowned me. Was I at 19 a child with no rights at all? I called my brother and told him what had just happened. He said, "They disowned you?" "Apparently." He said, "Maybe you're lucky. Now you don't have to deal with them." I said, "But they have no right to do this, and they had no right to steal the clothes, and I have every right to be angry." So he said, "So you want them to take you back into the family, whatever that means?" I said, "This way, they don't have to face what they did, and they can ignore me. And who knows what will happen next? And I won't accept this." My brother said, "Right. Well, since they're so religious, maybe you can tell them you were possessed when you yelled at them. Possessed by Mom's ghost." "Yeah," I said. "I can try that." The next phone call felt like a theater piece. Life was becoming a play, and I was about to test out some dialogue. I wondered, do they believe in ghosts, demons, and Dybbuk's? Every time I went to the kitchen, the heavy black model 500 telephone dominated the room. The phone, by its imperious presence, was telling me that it was time for the scene from the new play to begin. It was as though Arthur Miller was whispering into my ear, "Dial the phone. Call your Aunt Nancy and Uncle Herman." Okay, I dialed. Aunt Nancy picked up the phone. "Hello? It's Bruce. I think when I called you, I was possessed by a ghost or a Dybbuk, maybe." Silence. Herman, pick up the other line. It's Bruce. He says he was possessed. Bruce, what? You were possessed? A ghost? I think so. Silence. Herman spoke next. Well, in that case, it wasn't really you yelling. And I said, so do you consider me back in the family? Nancy and Herman both quickly confirmed that I was reinstated. I wanted to say something calmly about their taking my mother's things, but I said nothing. Okay then, said Uncle Herman. Goodbye now. Take care of yourself. Maybe get out of that house. Not too much later, I did move, with my parrot, Polly Rhythm, to an apartment on West 71st Street in Manhattan. As time passed, I continued to hear from Aunt Nancy and Uncle Herman. When Aunt Nancy called, she always started the conversation by asking, "Who's this?" And she did not mean, "Who are you?" but "Do you know who it is calling you?" So the conversation would go something like this. Ring! I pick up the phone, and I say, "Hello?" She says, "Who's this?" And I say, "I know it's you, Aunt Nancy." She says, "Really? You recognize my voice even though you never call me?" "Of course I do." "Well, that's at least something." When at age 88 Uncle Herman had a brain tumor, John and I went with Aunt Nancy to the hospital to see him. As he lay there barely conscious, Aunt Nancy sat on the bed and showed him old photographs of herself as a young girl, dressed up for a party or in a swimsuit at Coney Island. I asked her why she was doing that, and she said, "Who knows? Maybe he'll think that I look like this now. Maybe it'll wake him up." Years later, after I had told the exploding dog story many times to many people in many cities and countries, I began to wonder if it were true. Then once again at Aunt Nancy's house for dinner, I asked her, "Aunt Nancy, did you once tell a story about a frozen challah?" She interrupted, "With the dog that ate it and exploded, died dead? Yes, it's true." Whew, I got the answer. And I could tell the story again with a clear conscience, knowing that it really happened.